Hello, Barboursville staff. This is Jessica Ikes, Assistant Principal at Elementary North. I'm going to share the fourth dimension of Domain 1, which is activities. So this is the planning of activities within your lessons. Please make sure that you have your rubric and a highlighter ready. I'm going to point out the key differences in the vocabulary from the different performance levels. Being more familiar with these terms will help you to create more student-centered lessons. Let's begin with an overview of Dimension 1.4. The teacher is going to plan engaging, flexible lessons that encourage higher order thinking, persistence, and achievement. The sources of evidence for this dimension can be in the pre-conference and can also be during the 45-minute or more formal observation. Let's take a look at the rubric, beginning with proficient. If you will recall from Stephanie Martin's video training, that the proficient lessons are considered the rock-solid lessons. They're rock-solid teaching whenever you're proficient. The verbiage in the different performance levels are specific to student-centered action. So if you'll remember, the further left you go towards accomplished and distinguished is going to be more student-centered actions where the students are held accountable for their own learning. And the ones to the right are going to be the more teacher-directed activities. So let's start off with the first bullet on the proficient level. And this is where a lesson where questions that encourage all students to engage in complex, higher order thinking. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with proficient on each bullet, and we're going to move to the right, and then we're going to move to the left to see the difference between the teacher-directed to the student-centered. So let's compare the first bullet of proficient with the developing bullet. The difference in this one is that it's questions, this time they're going to promote limited or predictable or rote responses. And this time it's only going to encourage some complex or higher order thinking. So whenever we move down to improvement needed, this is going to be where it encourages little to no complex higher order thinking. Now we're going to go back to proficient, and we're going to move to the left to see the more student-centered activities. So this one is still questions that encourage all students, so that's the same as proficient, but what's different this time is we're going to add in the problem solving. So not only are they engaging in complex higher order thinking, but they're also doing some problem solving in there as well. Now to go to distinguished, this is a little bit different. We have opportunities for students that are going to generate questions that lead to further inquiry. And they're also going to promote complex higher order thinking, problem solving, and then they've added this new part in here, real world applications. All right, let's look at the second bullet under proficient. This one is talking about our instructional groups. So instructional groups are based on the needs of all students. Now, under developing, if you're basing your instructional group off the needs of most students, then that's a developing lesson. Under improvement needed, you're basing the groups off the needs of few students. So let's go back to proficient and let's move left to see the more student-centered actions and what the verbiage says. Under accomplished, it starts off the same, instructional groups based on the needs of all students. But this time it's going to be and maintains both group and individual accountability. So not only is not only is the whole group held accountable, but each child is individually held accountable as well. Now if you move over, it starts off the same, instructional groups based on the needs of all students. And this time it allows for students to take ownership of the group and individual accountability. So again, they're held more responsible there the further we go left. All right, we're moving on to our third bullet under proficient. This one says that all students understanding their individual roles within the instructional group. Now, when you move to the right, we're going to change our all students to most students. And then under improvement needed, it doesn't say few, it says the lack of student understanding of their individual roles within instructional groups. So let's see what we need to do to make our lessons more accomplished or distinguished. We still have all students understanding their individual roles within instructional groups. But this time we've added and they facilitate opportunities for students' input on goals and outcomes of activities. So students are allowed to have input on their goals for their instructional groups. So now we're going to get even more student-centered when we move to the left. This is the ability for all students. Now they're going not to just have input, but they're going to actually get to set their goals, reflect on their goals, evaluate and hold each other accountable within these instructional groups. Now we're moving on to the last bullet, the fourth bullet in Proficient. This one says activities, resources, technology, and instructional materials that are all aligned. All of them are aligned to the instructional purposes. Now when we move over to the right, you'll see the thing that's changed is instead of it saying that it's all aligned, now it's mostly aligned. And if you go to improvement needed, it's misaligned to the instructional purposes. So let's move on to accomplished and see what we need to do to make it more student-centered. Proficient is activities, resources, technology, and instructional materials that are all aligned to instructional purposes, which is what it says on accomplished, except we've added that are also varied and appropriate to the ability levels of students. So now we're looking more into the student needs. And whenever you move over to the left, it says the same thing as it does in accomplished, but this time we've added and actively engages them in ownership of their learning. So we're moving more student-centered and they're more accountable for their own learning. Now, these are the look-fors for Dimension 1.4. I like to write them at the bottom of my rubric on that page just so that I have them there for quick reference. So your look-fors for Dimension 1.4 is your questioning or your higher order thinking. So what types of questions are you asking during those activities? Not only what kind of questions are you asking, but what kind of questions are your students coming up with and generating on their own? Also, we talked about grouping in this lesson. We talked about the accountability of the students taking ownership of their own grouping and their own goals. We talked about the difference between the students taking ownership in those groupings or the teacher directing the grouping and their accountability there. So that goes into number 4, the student roles and responsibilities in those groups. Number 5, the activities, the resources, and the technology, making sure that they're aligned to the actual activities, that all are aligned, not just most of them. And then at the end, we talked about problem solving, where the students need to be actively engaged and they need to be problem solving themselves. So I like to write those at the bottom of my rubric. So thanks for listening to Dimension 1.4 activities in your lessons.